Most people believe they are thinking freely. They believe each decision is made in the moment, shaped by logic, personality, and choice. But neuroscience reveals something far stranger. Many of your decisions may be made before you even realize you are making them. In the early 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted an experiment that quietly shook the idea of free will. Participants were asked to perform a very simple action. Whenever they felt the urge, they would press a button. At the same time, their brain activity was being measured using electrodes that tracked electrical signals in the motor cortex. What Libet discovered was unexpected. A specific pattern of brain activity appeared hundreds of milliseconds before the participants reported consciously deciding to move their finger. The brain seemed to prepare the action before the conscious mind announced the intention. In other words, the body had already started the decision. At first, this sounds impossible. We feel our thoughts as the starting point of action. We think first, then we act, but the data suggested a different sequence. The brain initiates the process, and consciousness arrives slightly later, observing and explaining what is already underway. This phenomenon is often referred to as the readiness potential. It is a subtle rise in neural activity that occurs before voluntary movement. The fascinating part is not just that it appears before the action, but that it appears before the awareness of deciding. Imagine a quiet signal building inside your brain, slowly increasing in intensity until it crosses a threshold and triggers movement. By the time you feel the thought, "I am going to press the button," the internal process has already been unfolding. For many scientists, this raised a profound question. If the brain begins decisions before conscious awareness, what role does consciousness actually play? Some researchers propose that consciousness acts less like a commander and more like a narrator. The brain runs countless unconscious processes that evaluate options, predict outcomes, and prepare behaviors. When one path becomes dominant, the conscious mind constructs a story explaining why the action makes sense. This narrative feels like authorship, but it may simply be interpretation. Consider everyday decisions. When choosing what to eat, you often feel like you are weighing options deliberately. But studies using brain imaging show that preference signals can appear in neural activity before people report having made a choice. Subtle biases and prior experiences shape the decision before awareness catches up. This does not mean consciousness is useless. In fact, consciousness may have a different function entirely. Instead of initiating every action, it may specialize in monitoring, evaluating, and sometimes vetoing impulses generated by unconscious systems. Libet himself proposed this possibility. While the readiness potential appeared before conscious awareness, participants still had a small window in which they could stop the action before it happened. He called this the power of veto. Think of it like a train already moving down the tracks. The engine has started, but a signal further down the line can still stop it. In this interpretation, unconscious processes generate possibilities. Conscious awareness reviews them and occasionally intervenes. The majority of daily actions do not require intervention. Habits, routines, and familiar decisions flow automatically. The brain is optimized for efficiency. If every movement required conscious control, even basic life would become exhausting. Automation frees mental resources for complex reasoning and long-term planning. But automation also reveals how much of human behavior operates beneath awareness. Your posture, tone of voice, emotional reactions, and even moral judgments can be influenced by unconscious processing. Psychologists have demonstrated how subtle environmental cues shape decisions without our awareness. The smell of cleaning products can increase tidiness in behavior. Warm objects held briefly can influence perceptions of social warmth. Background music can alter purchasing decisions. These effects are not mind control. They are reminders that the brain constantly integrates sensory information, emotional memory, and predictive models before producing behavior. The conscious story comes afterward. This does not eliminate responsibility or agency. Instead, it reframes them. Real control may not lie in the instant of decision, but in shaping the systems that generate decisions in the first place. Your habits influence which impulses arise. Your environment influences which cues trigger behavior. Your knowledge influences how you evaluate options when awareness engages. Think of the brain as a vast network of competing signals. Each signal represents a possible action. Hunger signals compete with social norms. Curiosity competes with caution. Long-term goals compete with immediate pleasure. The strongest signal wins, unless another system intervenes. Over time, repeated behaviors strengthen certain pathways. If you repeatedly choose one action in a situation, the brain begins to anticipate it. The signal appears earlier and with greater intensity. Eventually, the action feels automatic. This is how habits form, but it is also how character develops. Small, repeated decisions shape the landscape of the brain. The more often a pathway is used, the more efficiently it activates in the future. What once required effort eventually becomes the easiest option. In this way, freedom may exist less in individual moments and more in long-term pattern building. You cannot control every impulse that appears, but you can influence which impulses are likely to appear tomorrow. This perspective aligns with modern models of predictive processing. The brain constantly generates expectations about the world and about your own behavior. When predictions prove accurate, the system becomes more confident. When predictions fail, it adjusts. Identity itself may be one of these predictions. The brain builds a model of what kind of person you are. That model then shapes the behaviors it expects from you. If the brain predicts that you avoid risk, it will generate stronger caution signals in uncertain situations. If it predicts persistence, it will generate stronger motivation signals when obstacles appear. Over time, prediction becomes personality. The remarkable part is that predictions can change. Neuroplasticity allows the brain to reorganize pathways based on experience. New behaviors introduce new data. If repeated consistently, they alter the probability landscape of future decisions. This means that the feeling of being a certain type of person may simply reflect which neural pathways have been practiced most often. The readiness potential experiment reminds us that the mind is not a single voice speaking commands. It is a complex orchestra of processes, many of which play their notes before the conductor is aware of the music. Consciousness then steps in and tries to make sense of the melody. Perhaps free will does not begin where we thought it did. It may not live in the instant of choice, but in the slow shaping of the brain that produces those choices. You are not only deciding in the moment, you are training the system that will decide later. And training is always happening, whether you are aware of it or not, whether you consent to it or not. Every experience you have, every environment you sit inside, every relationship you normalize, every thought you entertain without questioning, all of it is training the system. All of it is adjusting the probability landscape of who you will be tomorrow. This is both sobering and liberating in equal measure. Sobering because it means passive living is not neutral. When you drift through days without intention, consuming whatever is placed in front of you, reacting to whoever demands your attention, following the path of least resistance, you are still training something. The system does not pause and wait for you to become deliberate. It learns from everything, including your inaction, including your avoidance, including the years you spent telling yourself you would start when the time was right. The time was always right. The training was always occurring. The question was only what was being trained, and liberating because it means you do not need to be a different person to build a different life. You need to be the same person making slightly different choices with enough consistency that the system gradually updates its predictions about what you are capable of. You do not need extraordinary willpower. You need ordinary repetition aimed in a new direction. This is what the research keeps returning to, not grand transformation, not sudden awakening, not the dramatic before and after, but the quiet accumulation of small behavioral data points that slowly shift the brain's model of who you are and what you expect from yourself. Every time you do the thing you said you would do, the brain recalibrates. Every time you tolerate discomfort instead of escaping it, the threat prediction softens. Every time you show up for yourself in a moment when the old pattern would have won, a new pathway gets slightly stronger. You will not feel it happening. That is the nature of gradual change. But one day you will notice that the person you are becoming no longer resembles the forecasts you used to believe. And that is not luck, that is training.